Right, well, here we go. We are in the book of Revelation. If you haven't been here previous weeks, we're working our way through this book of the Bible, the last book of the Bible. And just for context, what's happened so far is that John, the same John who we read about in the Gospels, a disciple of Jesus, the same John who's written not only that Gospel of John, but also 3 letters to churches, is on the island of Patmos. He's in exile there because of his belief in Jesus, because he won't keep quiet about Jesus. And in that place of exile, he has a vision of Jesus. He has a vision of Jesus walking amongst 7 lampstands, symbolizing 7 churches. And then off the back of this vision, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, Jesus then dictates to him 7 letters to these 7 churches, which are for those churches and also for us, in as far as they relate to us as well. Last week we looked at Ephesus. Summary of Ephesus. Anyone want to give a one-liner for Ephesus? Don't lose your first love. Absolutely. Yes. Doing all kinds of stuff great, but don't lose your first love. That would be a good summary of Ephesus. Today we're on to Smyrna and Pergamum, or Pergamon, depending on your translation. And already we're into some of the more difficult terms of phrase, aren't we? I'm just picking out some, naming them up front. Synagogue of Satan, what's that about? Lots about Satan's throne, white stones, hidden manna. It sounds like it could get a bit complicated. Don't worry, we will get there. And actually, most of it is not as complicated as you might think, but it is hard-hitting, of course. But here we are. We're in Smyrna, which is modern-day Izmir, if you know your Turkish geography. And yeah, we'll just go back one if we can. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Every time. This is my title for today. Does anyone know the only collaboration between Queen and David Bowie? Under Pressure, thank you. 2 churches under pressure here today, Smyrna and Pergamum. And we're going to start off in Smyrna. Now, remember from last week that each letter starts with Jesus identifying himself. And he doesn't give his full list of titles, as he might do, but he picks 1 or 2 things which are particularly pertinent to the church that he's speaking to. And for Smyrna, he reveals himself as the first and the last. Let's just read that bit again briefly. So, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. Now, this is not random. This is Jesus showing that he knows the people he's speaking to. Now, we could pick out lots of bits from this, but particularly I want to say Smyrna knew itself as the first city of Asia. It was widely seen as being the most beautiful city all around, and on many of their inscriptions they would have Smyrna, the first city of Asia. They were supposedly the most beautiful, not the biggest, but the most beautiful. They'd been rebuilt recently, we'll get to that in a second. And Jesus is just saying, I'm the first, just so we know, I'm the first, and the last as well. But also, I'm the one who died and came to life again. Now, this is a really significant thing for Smyrna because earlier in sort of fairly recent history for them, in the last few hundred years for them, the king of an area called Lydia had come through and had razed Smyrna to the ground. He'd reduced it to basically a village. It had been a city, he had reduced it to a village. It was inhabited just by a few people. And then Alexander the Great, when he conquered the whole known world, he had this dream, having conquered Smyrna, in which he saw it rebuilt, and he said, I'm going to rebuild this city. And so it was brought back to life again. And part of this city's history, and you'd see it on inscriptions, was the city that died and was brought to life again. And, subtext, even better than it was before. We're now the first city of Asia. We're the most beautiful. Jesus is speaking to their context and saying, I know you. I know what you're like. If he was speaking to the church in Wheatley, he might say, I am Jesus who breaks open stone lockups. Or he might talk about us being a church high on a hill, exposed to wind and lightning, just like our windmill up on the hill, and the one previously that got struck by lightning and burnt down. Jesus is the first and the last. He's the one who died and came to life. And as we look at a church that's under pressure, it's also really good for them to know, if you're facing death for Jesus, you want to be facing death for the one who is Lord of life and death, don't you? That's the one you can trust if you're facing death. So let's just dive in with some of the more troublesome bits of this, because otherwise they're going to be sitting there niggling away at us. Fairly early on, he says, I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. This text has been used in the past to justify anti-Semitism of all kinds, and so it's just worth naming it up front. That's not actually what this is saying. Jews were exempt in the Roman world from certain Roman rules. So if you were in the Roman world, you had to do military service. You also had to swear not just an oath of allegiance to Caesar, but it was a religious ceremony. You'd have to throw some incense onto a flame, and you'd have to swear by the genius of Caesar, is the phrase that was used. And you'd often say, Caesar Kurios, Caesar is Lord, as you did it. That was a rule for everybody. In fact, you had to do that in order to be able to buy and sell, to get certain licenses, this kind of thing. It was part of the makeup of the Roman world, unless you were Jewish. And there was a respect for the Jewish monotheistic faith, possibly bought through the cost of the many rebellions of the Jews, possibly bought out of respect. It's a bit hard to work out. But Jews were exempt from that. They didn't do military service, and they didn't have to swear by the genius of Caesar. And so they were a class apart in that regard. But the trouble is that Christianity obviously is originally just an offshoot of Judaism. It's seen as a Jewish sect. But now you have all these people who are not ethnically Jewish also kind of swelling the ranks of people who not only will not do military service, but will also not swear by the genius of Caesar. And the Romans start to get quite upset about this and a bit concerned. Are we going to end up with this spreading and all kinds of people refusing to do these things? And so they oppressed this sect of Judaism. And the Jews, many of them, were concerned that their rights were going to be taken away. They were concerned that they might have what they'd won at this great expense, this independence from those Roman regulations, taken away from them. And some Jews, and this is certainly not all, but some Jews, therefore, took it upon themselves to denounce these followers of the way, this Jewish sect that became Christianity, to denounce them to the Roman authorities. Now, at this point, you see the context for these particular ones. It doesn't say all Jews, does it? But it says, those who say they are Jews but are not and are a synagogue of Satan. This is what we think is the context in Smyrna. We're certainly aware that this was happening in Smyrna, is that these are those who, their allegiance to their protection is greater than their sense of loyalty to fellow Jews who believed that the Messiah had come. And so they're denouncing them, they're exposing them to public trial and often death. But it's worth just saying on this as well, what's really going on here? Who is it who's really behind all of this? Who's behind people denouncing Christians and putting them in jail? I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen puppet shows. This is they're slightly macabre puppets. But can you see in the background, just up here, these kind of... Oh, my thing isn't working, is it? There we go. Just up here, these shadowy figures. They've kind of got black hoods over them, so you can't really see them properly, so they don't distract from the puppets. But behind the scenes, everything that these people do is being choreographed by these shadowy figures in the background. Can you see them up there? I don't know. There we are. Can you see those figures? Yeah. And Jesus, through John, is really clear. This is what's going on, and we'll see it later on as well in this passage. Behind the scenes, it's not simply rivalry between different sects of Judaism. It's not rivalry between ethnicities, because bear in mind, many of these new Christians are coming from a non-Jewish background, and that would have been very offensive to some of the Jews. It's not just a rivalry between ethnicities. What's going on here is, behind the scenes, Satan is pulling the strings. This gets unpacked more later in the book, so we'll look at that more in chapters sort of 12 through 14. But all of this sort of socio-political antagonism, it has a puppeteer behind the scenes. The devil will throw some of you into jail, is what John writes in just a verse or two later, not the Romans will throw you in jail, although that's physically what was happening, but the devil will throw some of you into jail. Behind the scenes is this shadowy puppeteer. Who's here's done the Alpha course or seen some of the videos? There's a really interesting testimony on the Alpha course. I think I may have shared it here before, from a lawyer who had been on the course and he'd just been like, I just don't buy all this stuff. It just doesn't really click for me. Until he saw the video entitled Evil, the Problem of Evil, which explains that there is not only a sovereign good God over the world, but there is also a not sovereign but powerful evil one. And that was his moment when he accepted Christ. He said, I suddenly realized I had seen nothing else in the world that explained what I saw in the courtroom. But when I realized that there is an evil one, an accuser, behind the scenes, suddenly it made sense of what I see in my professional life. And that was his time when he chose to come to faith, because he'd understood that there really is somebody pulling the strings behind the scenes. So, that's the situation we're in. There is this oppression from the Romans, antagonized by some of the Jews in Smyrna. They're facing imprisonment, they're facing potentially death. What would a loving God say to them? What would you want to say to them? Presumably you'd want to say, don't worry, I'll keep you safe. It's okay. I'm your good father, I'm your good shepherd. Don't worry, it's not going to go wrong for you. That might be what you'd want to say. It's probably what I would want to say as well, but it's not what Jesus says to them. Remember, at the beginning, the context for this was John identified himself as John, your brother in... Somebody said it. Suffering. Yeah, your brother in suffering. Absolutely. John is their brother in suffering. He is writing this as somebody who is suffering for Jesus. And the word that Jesus gives this church through John is not, don't worry, you won't suffer. Because the suffering they're actually experiencing is suffering for doing what is right. It's not because they're doing something wrong and so they're suffering. They're doing something right and so they're suffering. One of the commentaries that I love on Revelation is called Discipleship on the Edge by a chap called Darrell Johnson. And he writes this: look at it this way, when the light begins to shine in the darkness has two options. One is to acknowledge what the light reveals and make the necessary changes. The other is to try to extinguish the light. The lampstand of the church at Smyrna was shining brightly. God's will for life was being made very clear, and the darkness of the city could not tolerate it, and the lampstand was feeling the pressure. They're facing pressure for doing what's right. I love this from a Scottish Presbyterian minister called Thomas Torrance. The church is a troublesome element. Are we a troublesome element? The church is a troublesome element which creates tension among the nations and ferment in the course of history. Just as Jesus Christ, in the midst of a sinful world, inevitably became the storm centre for human sin and its guilty reactions, ending on the cross, so the Christian church, as far as she remains faithful and true to Jesus, inevitably causes trouble and ferment and brings upon herself the violent reaction of evil. The church cannot be a true church without causing trouble. The church cannot be a true church without causing trouble. It's an interesting one, isn't it? So the church is experiencing this pressure. The word in Greek is thlipsis, which means pressure. It was the word used, among other things, for a form of torture where heavy rocks were placed on top of people's chests until they could not breathe. That's the word thlipsis. It's the word Jesus uses whenever he talks about tribulation in his teaching. So when he talks, for instance, about the parable of the sower, and he says when the weeds grow up and the thlipsis gets in there, they're choked. Smyrna is not among the weeds. The thlipsis, the tribulation, is seeking to oppress them, but they are standing firm. And the result is that it's not just pressure, but it's also testing. And testing, remember, doesn't just mean in the sense of sitting a test. When you see if silver is pure, you test it. You test it and you find out how pure it is. And this is what Martin Luther said. Whatever virtue tribulation finds us in, it develops more fully. If anyone is carnal or weak or blind, wicked, irascible, haughty, and so forth, tribulation will make them more so. On the other hand, if someone's strong and spiritual, wise, pious, gentle, humble, he will become more spiritual, powerful, wise, pious, gentle, and humble. There's a purifying that happens under this thlipsis, under this pressure, which is really, really precious. And that's why I picked up this map here. Some of you will know Open Doors World Watch List. Wave a hand if you've seen the World Watch List in the last year or two. Yeah, okay. So you know this. And these are the 50 countries that are most suffering for the name of Jesus at the moment. These are all places where faith is being refined. And actually the stories that you hear coming out of them are stories of perseverance, stories of beautiful faith in the midst of struggles. There's a refining that goes on in the church in Smyrna. And so Jesus doesn't say, I'm going to take that away, much as I'm sure his heart of love would rather that they didn't have to suffer. And yet, there is a perfection that comes through it. Jesus promised life to the full, not a charmed life, if we can use that expression, not a life where everything just goes right for you all the time, but a life to the full. A life in which there may well be intense suffering for what's right, but also deep joy in all circumstances. And that's actually life to the full, much more than kind of, I don't know, the anesthetic life where nothing touches you, you know, no sadness and no real joy. They're kind of the numb life, if you like. That might seem more appealing, but actually life to the full is life in which there is suffering for a worthy cause, right? Not just meaningless suffering, but righteous suffering, but also fullness of joy. And fullness of joy in all circumstances. When things are difficult, we can still find joy. In the midst of death and sickness, there's still joy, because it's Jesus who is the source of that joy. And also a life of power, mighty power to overcome. We see this in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, don't we? They do suffer, and they do experience joy, and they also experience the power of God to see the gospel advancing. And all of those go together, and that's the fullness of life that we are promised. It's a life that's free from fear of anything apart from the Lord. I don't know if Luke was getting us earlier to think back to, you know, that first love that we had. I remember travelling back from a church weekend in Northampton. I had been hanging around the church for a couple of years, but not raised in a Christian family. And we were driving back from Northampton in a Ford Escort, crammed into the back. And I just had my head leaning back on the parcel shelf like this, and the sun was streaming in through the back windscreen. And I just remember feeling light, as in just not heavy light. Because it was like all the guilt and all the fear in my life had been lifted off. I don't know if you have had that experience, or if perhaps you're aware of quite what it is not to live in fear. Not to live in fear of world events, because Jesus is the Lord of history. Not to live in fear of what might happen in your life, because, you know, if my bank balance crumbles and my house falls down, Jesus is still the Lord of my life. If my relatives get sick, and if I have to give up my job and care for them, Lord is still the Lord of my life. Do you know that lack of fear? That's what we get to live in. Smyrna was led by a chap called Polycarp in the early centuries. He was a disciple of John's, so sort of second generation, Jesus, John, Polycarp. And he was one of the few who lived to a very old age. He was martyred aged 86. And this was what he said when he was encouraged in the arena in front of crowds baying for his blood. He was encouraged, once again, you know, have respect for your age. Just swear by the genius of Caesar and all this goes away. And he says, 86 years I have served Jesus and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king and my saviour? This is life to the full. We're not afraid. He's not afraid of beasts or fire, which is what he got in the end. He got fire. Because we have Jesus, and he is the Lord of life and death. Do you see why Jesus reveals himself as the first and the last, the Lord of life and death? We need to know this. We're not facing death for Jesus. But do you know what? It makes us bold if we know that he is Lord of it, doesn't it? And it gives us strength to persevere. How do we persevere? Paul writes in Romans 5 that we can persevere in all circumstances because we know that God uses difficulty for good. There's this train, isn't there? Suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces, there's one before hope, character, and character hope. And hope doesn't disappoint us because Jesus has poured out his Holy Spirit in our hearts. It's also worth saying that because he's Lord, Jesus is able to put a limit on this. This is not endless suffering. This is not endless persecution. What does it say? It says, I've lost the reference, 10 days. Somebody can find it. 2:10. Thank you very much. Yes, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Now, I've mentioned before, numbers matter in Revelation. This probably doesn't mean 10 literal days. Among other things, the whole business around Polycarp took nearly that. 10 days is a finite period of time. It's not just a day. It's not gone in a moment. It's not a year. But it's 10 days. 10 is a number of fullness. It's lots, but it's days. And what this seems to be saying is that there will be a time of persecution. It will last, but not forever. Hold on. You see, if Jesus is really Lord of life and death, he's able to put a limit on it. He's able to say, you can test my people, but only so far. And beyond that, you can't. This is not in the hands of the persecutors. They don't get to decide how long they can persecute the church for. Jesus is able to put a limit on it. He is the Lord. We also persevere for the joy set before us, for the crown of life. We don't have to fear the first death because we won't be touched by the second death. Now, what does that mean? Those who are victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Later on in chapter 20, we'll see a description of the second death. But the reality is all of us, our physical bodies will die. Our physical bodies are going to die sooner or later. All of us are going to go through that. But there's a second death, sometimes described as the death of the soul, eternal death. The picture of it in Revelation is a lake of fire. We're not talking about something pleasant. We're talking about eternal judgment. And Jesus says, if you're victorious, if you persevere, you won't be touched by that. Despite the fact that all of us have deserved it, because Jesus has paid for that, if we persevere in faith in him, we won't be touched by that. What a promise. What a way to live. We don't have to worry about the first death because we're not going to be touched by the second. That's his message to the church in Smyrna. What about the church in Pergamum then? Now, Pergamum is largely ruined, but this reconstruction is from a museum in Berlin. This is a reconstruction of something that was dug up in Pergamum. We'll get to that in just a second. Who does Jesus reveal himself as to the church in Pergamum? Of all the things that came out in that first picture, he reveals himself. These are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. Where was the sword? Coming out of his mouth. Thank you. Yes, whoever said that over here. Okay, this is about the words of God, the truth, the importance of the truth. Where else do we get double-edged swords in the scriptures? We get it in Hebrews, don't we? The word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight, and everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. This is how Jesus reveals himself to Pergamum. So that should immediately make us think that what is at stake here is to do with truth, to do with God's words and to do with truth. He also says, I know where you live, and he identifies it as where Satan has his throne. I chose this picture here because this is the altar of Pergamon. There were many, many temples in Pergamon. Apparently, temples and altars didn't always go together. Sometimes you just have an altar. No temple particularly associated with it. It was just an altar for making sacrifices. This one may have been dedicated to Athena, it may have been dedicated to Zeus, or it may just not really have been particularly focused on any one god. But it kind of looks like a throne, doesn't it? And this is exactly what it looked like. You know, they've dug up the remains of it archaeologically, they've got some of the friezes, and it's been recaptured. Some people think that this is what John was referring to, that this huge pagan altar was the throne of Satan. It could be that. But actually, more than anything else, Pergamum was just full of temples. There was a temple to everything. If you wanted healing, there was a temple to Asclepion. If you wanted wisdom or victory, there was a temple to Athena. If you wanted lordship, there was a temple to Zeus and a temple to Caesar. There were temples to Aphrodite. There were temple for this and temple for that. Everything. It was a city that was full of counterfeits. You wanted belonging, you could worship with counterfeit belonging in a Roman ritual orgy. You wanted healing, you could have fake healing through snakes crawling over you in the temple of Asclepion. If you wanted wisdom, you could get counterfeit wisdom from Athena, who seems to have had problems of her own even in mythology and probably isn't the greatest source of wisdom even there. If you wanted counterfeit pleasure, you could engage in some of the fairly horrific ritual worship practices at the time. They had counterfeit everything. And this church in Pergamum has been holding out against the pressure to let go of Jesus. That's what we read here. They've been holding out. You haven't let go, even when Antipas, who we believe was one of their leaders, was put to death. And yet, something of that world has snuck into the church. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. There are some amongst you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin, so they ate food sacrificed to idols and committed sexual immorality. This is a reference to a story in Israel's history. Israel was marching to the promised land. The king of Moab wanted to oppose them, and so he hires this guy called Balaam, and he says, curse these people for me. And some of you know this, it's in Numbers 26-ish. It's a beautiful passage. It's quite funny in many ways, because Balaam's hired to curse Israel, and he gets up there and he builds this altar, and then he starts blessing them. And he can't stop himself blessing them. And Balak goes, oh, maybe it's because you're over here. Why don't we go over to this mountain and you can curse them there? And he goes to this mountain and he can still only bless them. And finally, he leads them up to this peak where he can look out of the whole camp of Israel. And it just wells up in Balaam. How beautiful is your dwelling place, O Israel? And he just blesses and blesses and blesses. He can't curse them because he's constrained by the Lord to bless them instead. And so where the power encounter has failed, where Balak has failed to get a curse on Israelites, he says, what else can we do? And Balaam says, I'll tell you what you can do. Get some of your prettiest women to go and mingle in the camp, and they'll probably want to take them for their wives, and then they can introduce them to your practices of worshipping Baal, and you'll lead them away from this worship of the Lord that seems to be what's causing God to bless them. So the power encounter fails, so go for temptation instead. That's Balaam's teaching. And that's what we see happening in Pergamum. They've stood firm against the fire. They've stood firm against this pressure to cave in. I wonder what that looks like in our lives. That pressure to denounce Christ. You know, maybe you've stood firm against that. The devil's second string is, okay, I wonder if I can just tempt you away. Through immorality, through false worship. We don't know if this is what the Nicolaitans are teaching or if that's a separate practice. It's unclear from this, but they seem at least to be similar. The drawing away of people after false gods. Eating meat sacrificed to idols meant going along to the temple and eating at their worship feasts. And then afterwards there would be prostitutes present and they would get up to things together. And that was their practice. And here people are saying, oh yeah, we can still do that and follow Jesus. And Jesus says, no, this has got to stop, or I will come with the sword of my mouth and fight against them. Don't settle for the counterfeit. This world offers us counterfeits all over. It offers us counterfeit belonging, counterfeit lordship, counterfeit wisdom, counterfeit pleasure, just like Pergamum. True lordship is found in Jesus. True pleasure is found in Jesus. I particularly want to say it's great youth to have you with us today. There's lots out there about what pleasure looks like for you guys. There's lots out there about what the world can offer you if all you do is just put aside these Christian morals that those stuffy people are telling you and just go for it. I want to say true pleasure is found in Jesus and Jesus alone. True allegiance, true belonging is not your hobby or your club. It's not the political party that you belong to or the ideology you subscribe to. It's Jesus. It's here, the church. This is where we belong. And along with this, what we do with our physical bodies matters. Actually, by the time John's writing this, there's a heresy called Gnosticism that's snuck into the church, and one of the teachings of that was that your body's evil anyway, so it doesn't matter what you do with it as long as you keep your spirit pure. It's not true. What we do with our bodies really matters. Just in landing this, and then we're going to break bread, and it leads us very nicely into that. Jesus always gives a promise as well as a warning. So the warning is, don't settle for the counterfeits, or I'll fight against you with the sword of my mouth. But if you stay faithful, I'll give you hidden manna. Now, manna was God's provision in a desert place, wasn't it? Pergamum is a desert place for many of these people. They're outcasts from society, they're under pressure on all sides, and yet God provides. God sustains. I don't know how you feel about your life with Jesus, whether you feel like you're under pressure. God is able to give you that hidden manna to sustain you in those times. And also, I'll give you a white stone with a new name on it known only to you. Now, we don't fully know what this means. There's a couple of suggestions. The one that I find most compelling is we know that it was the habit, if you were giving a very, very posh banquet or party of some kind in the Roman world, as a status symbol, your invite would be a piece of white marble with the name of the person engraved on it. Think about it as a very early stage invite card. Okay, and that was given to you. You'd hand it in as you went into the banquet. This is my invitation. It's on a piece of white marble. I'm not going to fake that in a hurry. There's a suggestion this is talking about that invite to the messianic banquet, that celebration when we are with Jesus forever. And there'll be one with your name written on it, Joan, and one with your name written on it, Roger, one with your name written on it, Megan. You get to come in because you belong to Jesus, and he's put that new name on a stone that's known only to you. Now, there's other things that it might mean, but that seems to be the heart of it anyway, doesn't it? It's personal to you, an invitation to be with Jesus. We get to eat at the heavenly banquet, and we get to have a foretaste of it today as we break bread. These have been the challenges so far. The challenge to the church in Ephesus was, don't lose your passion for Christ. The challenge to the church in Smyrna is, persevere, keep going. The challenge to Pergamum is, reconsecrate yourself. Come back to that place of holiness where you belong to Jesus and only Jesus. And so I'm going to lead us in praying 3 prayers now. One is about passion, one is about perseverance, and one is about reconsecration. And just want to invite you, I'll leave a bit of space after I pray, just want to invite you in your heart to add to that, whatever you feel you need to add to that as we prepare to break bread together. And then after that, we'll explain how we're going to do that. Each of these begins with a quote from Scripture. And the first one is from Song of Songs. Place me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm. For love is as strong as death. Its jealousy unyielding as the grave. It burns like blazing fire, like a mighty flame. Many waters cannot quench love. Rivers cannot sweep it away. If one were to give all the wealth of one's house for love, it would be utterly scorned. Jesus, you showed your love for us so powerfully when you chose to die for us. Loving Father, your love is so great that you sent your only Son to save us. We respond to you now with our own wholehearted love and devotion. You're worth everything we have. You're worth everything we are. We remember the gift of your blood and your body with love and with adoration. Whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. This is what Jesus says in Revelation. I am coming soon. Hold on to what you have so that no one will take your crown. The one who is victorious I will make a pillar in the temple of my God, and never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. And I will also write on them my new name. Jesus, whatever comes, we hold on to you. You are our firm hope. Your promises are true. We trust the covenant which you made with us and which you sealed with your blood. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires that you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. Jesus, we consecrate ourselves to you again, and as we eat the bread and drink the wine, we choose to be set aside for you, to be yours forever, and to serve your purposes in your world. We're going to break bread now. We're going to do it slightly differently today. This is a communal act, and we will all break bread together. But we're actually going to have a song as we break bread. This is a song about Jesus, the Son of Suffering. And as we sing, I just want to encourage you to come up either one by one, or one person can come up for two and take bread for two. We remember Jesus' body broken for us. We remember his blood poured out for us. And we remember it as a source of our love for Christ, because he first loved us. We remember it as a reminder to persevere. And we do this as a way of marking out that we are set apart for Jesus. If you are here and you're not a follower of Jesus, then please pray out of these things. But I just ask you not to come up for the bread and the wine. This is something for those who have committed to follow Christ already. And if that's something you'd like to do, then have a talk afterwards, and we'd love to talk that over, and you could do this next time. But this is something which Jesus said was set aside for those who've already made that decision. But if you have, just as the band are playing, I encourage you to come up, take some bread, take some wine, take it for somebody next to you if you'd like, and then to share that and to pray through these things: passion for Christ, perseverance, and consecration to him.